Very pleased to be able to convene this panel today, Mexico Swings Left, Implications for Mexican Democracy. Just briefly, I want to thank Mauricio Font, who directs the Bildner Center, as well as Araceli Tinajero, who's not here today, but who helped pull this panel together. And I should note that it's the 10th year of the Mexican studies group within the Bildner Center. I'm on that steering committee. Pablo probably as well, no? Okay. But in any event, Araceli and I were helped to bring that together, and very pleased to see that it's 10 years going. And we host within the Bildner Center several discussions a year related to Mexican culture, politics, and contemporary events. So on July 1st, Mexico experienced one of the most important political transformations in its modern history. The presidential election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, more commonly referred to by the acronym formed by his initials, AMLO, has ushered in a range of conflicting emotions and political predictions regarding the nation's future. There is indeed much at stake here. This panel today offers a unique opportunity to explore these stakes and to delve more deeply into the social, political, and diplomatic history of Mexico and its relationship to the United States. I'm very pleased to have the chance to moderate a conversation with two people I admire greatly, Pablo Picasso, an historian of 20th century Mexican cultural and social history at Columbia University, whose most recent book is titled A History of Infamy, Crime, Truth, and Justice in Mexico, and Andrés Lajous, a PhD candidate in sociology at Princeton, whose research and writings focus on urban development, state planning, and contemporary Mexican politics. For myself, I'm the Director of Latin American Caribbean Studies at Stony Brook University, and have published on Mexican popular culture and U.S. Latin American relations. I'm finalizing a book manuscript now titled The Last Good Neighbor, Mexico in the Global 60s, which in thinking about what is happening these days in U.S.-Mexican relations appears increasingly timely. This will be a great panel, and I want to let you know that the Bildner Center is recording this conversation, and it will be made available via the center's YouTube channel. I'm certain that Pablo and Andrés will introduce many questions for us to ponder, but I would like to introduce at the outset three central questions that strike me as fundamental. First, what does this election mean for the future of Mexico's political party system? AMLO came to power as the candidate of a party called Morena that was formed merely 4 years ago. For the first time in decades, all of the traditionally relevant parties, that is the PRD, which was the left party, the PRI, the ruling party for more than 70 years, in the middle, let's say, and the PAN party on the right, are now in the minority. Is Mexico evolving toward a truly multi-party political direction? Or will Morena absorb what remains of the left party, PRD, and possibly claim the space once occupied by the country's ruling party for over 70 years, the PRI. Second, can these elections translate into better governability with respect to the central problems facing Mexico, namely public insecurity, judicial impunity, and wide-scale corruption? With majority control over Congress, the new government will readily be able to pass laws and perhaps even constitutional amendments, but it is not clear how legislative fixes will tackle these fundamental challenges. Moreover, high expectations for AMLO to succeed, "I will not fail you," he promised in his victory speech, will undoubtedly generate even greater disappointment later on if the reality or perception of daily experience persists or worsens. And finally, does President Trump's stated antipathy toward Mexico, NAFTA, and traditional Western alliances more generally present Mexico with an historic opportunity to effect a global pivot away from the United States, for example, by garnering new markets and investment from China and Russia? Or does the importance of the U.S. market, and thus the strategic utility of sustaining a good neighbor relationship with the United States, still overwhelmingly dictate the parameters of Mexico's foreign policy options? Many fear, others hope, that AMLO will marshal Mexico's deep reserve of revolutionary nationalism to confront the United States across a host of issues. But does that historic nationalism even exist in a nation that is unsettled by violence and with a cynical regard for governing institutions, not to mention the fact that huge numbers of Mexicans now find themselves as part of a North American diaspora? In short, can and should AMLO count upon Mexico's revolutionary nationalism to mobilize support for new terms in the bilateral relationship? Okay, and with that, I'd like to open it up, and we'll start with Pablo Picasso, who's going to provide some historical context, and then we'll shift to Andrés. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for the invitation to Araceli Tinajero, who organized this, and she's not here, Araceli, but I wanted to thank you her anyway. So what I wanted to do is give a very general historical, context to begin to understand the significance of these elections. And I think that they have a great historical importance. I mean, it's the first time we can say that the left wins the presidential elections in Mexico. We can talk later about what the left means, but we know that there is a long history of electoral manipulation, clearly since 1988, in which many people of the left thought that they had been robbed of their rights. So this win, if anything, is very important because it consolidates the electoral system long term. It was a problem in the perception of many voters that we will never win with this system. The right will win. This proves that there can be competition. I don't think that the results will be reversed. It's very clear that all parties, including the president, recognize the results of the elections, and the electoral authorities are not going to try to do anything. It seems clear that the hope, at least in the political class, is that there can be a smooth transition. That, in other words, that even though this might be a win for the left, it's not something that will alter radically central aspects of Mexican politics. No? We can say, I mean, my view would be, I mean, we can call this a win for the left because it's a candidate and a party that emphasizes social issues, redistribution, justice, and that in more general terms, we can interpret as a reaction to at least a couple of decades of neoliberal reforms that have really weakened the safety network for most Mexicans. Inequality has increased, and the capacity of the state to deal with the effects of structural reforms has been reduced. So I think it's legitimate to say that this vote expresses a reaction against those decades of change. No? I don't know if we can still or already talk about post-neoliberalism, but it's clear that something has changed there too. No? Obviously, a lot of the things that happened, in the last 30 years cannot be reversed. No? One thing that López Obrador said at the first speech after the election was, he's not going to touch the autonomy of the Banco de México. He's not going to mess with the financial system as it is, no? Because I think everyone sees value in controlling inflation, and so certain things will not be changed. I mean, having said that, I would like to say that this is not, in my opinion, a populist movement that we can easily compare to other elections in Latin America of the past 20 years. Those comparisons, especially if we use or if we emphasize the term populism, can be very misleading, and I think that they all need detail and nuance. Obviously this is not Venezuela. This is not going to be a Chavez regime, first of all because they don't have that much money as Chavez had when he came to, but also because the instincts and the basic drive of the leader are very different, right? I mean, Chavez was a military figure. López Obrador was a candidate who was running for 14 years until he won the election. it is not Argentina, in the sense it's not, there is no Peronism where the ideology or, as vague as it was, of the leader could be capitalized politically by a party. It's not there yet. Morena is only 4 years old, and López Obrador is not that kind of leader that has doctrinary opinions that have to be interpreted that way. At least I don't see it yet developing. And also, one thing that I believe distinguishes this from other cases is that there is a political party too. I mean, we shouldn't neglect the role of Morena in this. They were present across the country. They won, Congress, 5 governorships, I think. So we cannot talk about a leader that talks directly to the masses, as it would be the populist ideal. I mean, there is an apparatus there that I think is going to become more important in the next years. And there was a coalition too. If you look at the kind of people who joined López Obrador's wagon, I mean, you have people from the right, the PES, a small conservative party. You have people on to the left of Morena. So it was very clear that what López Obrador was doing this time around compared to other attempts is that building coalitions and bringing people in. And it's very pragmatic and obviously cannot work in the same way as this charismatic leadership. Another thing that this is not, as some commentators have suggested in Mexico, this is not a new version of the PRI. Many people in Mexico are saying, well, now we're going to have another 70 years of a dominant party that will control Congress, governorships, and the presidency, like we had in the 20th century. What we now call the PRI, first Partido Nacional Revolucionario, Partido de la Revolución Mexicana, Partido Revolucionario Institucional, since 1929 control the electoral system in Mexico. This is not the case. First of all, because this government is the product of an overwhelming electoral result, which the emergence of the PRI was something that came from the top, basically putting together smaller parties. The corporative structure that was in place in the 1930s to build that single-party rule in Mexico that was so stable is not there anymore. I mean, we don't have peasant organizations or labor organizations that are as powerful as they were in the 20th century. So they cannot use that. The nationalism that we can ask whether it will emerge now, and certainly there is a setting for that. If López Obrador wanted to exploit a nationalist rhetoric, it would work because the U.S. is is offering the perfect straw man, right? I guess to focus nationalist impulse, but I don't see that really. I mean, and if you look at his Minister of Foreign Relations, it's someone who, Marcelo Ebrard, no? He hired Rudy Giuliani to help him deal with police issues in Mexico City. He's not going to go out and insult Trump or provoke Trump. In part because, and I think this was clear from the beginning, I think Trump and López Obrador had a phone conversation the day after the election. Mexico cannot mess with that relationship, at least for now. I don't think they can start, bringing China in, because the Mexican economy is dependent to an extent, to a very great extent on the U.S. trade. So they are going to be very careful, just like Peña Nieto was, about this relationship. Yes, there will be, I'm sure, disappointment. There always is, and if you look at the way people were celebrating this, it's kind of inevitable. But one thing that I think is happening too is that there is backlash too, and we shouldn't neglect that. If you listen to not just the newspapers, but the social media, there is and it's something that was already there, but now it's become very clear. There is a backlash against this movement of poor people and this vulgar candidate who won the presidency. There is racism that was always there, but now it's becoming very, very loud. No? So that makes me think that even if Morena consolidates power and doesn't, doesn't go the way of most of the Mexican left in history, breaking up in small groups. Even if they manage to stay together, there is a party of the right. There is a movement of the right that will continue to be pressing. They have been in power for at least 18 years. I mean, if you want to count just the PAN years from 2000 to 2012. The nucleus of the PAN is still there, but also the ideology is still there. So I don't think that will go away. And if anything, it might become stronger, no? At least rhetorically. No? The other, possible change that we will, we have to see. We don't know what's going to happen, but I think that there will be changes there too. Is in relation with the problem of violence and organized crime. It's very difficult to predict, and in general, if you look at crime, things don't change one year to the next. They take a long time. No? But I think that there will be, we have to follow closely, but the people who are going to be in key positions are already talking about laws that will amnesty people who are not violent offenders related to drug trafficking, the majority of people in prison. They are talking about truth commission, or finding out what happened with the thousands of disappeared and people killed in the last 12 years. Bringing the armed forces back to their barracks, in other words, having a civilian police force deal with this. I think those are the right gestures. Obviously, we want to see if this can happen, but I would say that 1 year or 2 years from now, this will be probably one of the areas in which the government will be judged by public opinion, no? Whether they were able. What I also think, I don't know, what you think, Andrés, is as happens with every change of government in Mexico, violence will increase in the short term. It's inevitable, because all the deals that have been made will break, so you have to establish new deals, and there will be competition, there will be more violence in the short term. I'm pretty sure about that. What matters is what happens a year from now, maybe 2 years from now. Hopefully, it won't continue with the current trend. No? But I will stop here so Andrés can talk more about the specifics of the election.
Thank you. I'm going to stand up here to, hi. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Pablo, for your introduction and the historical background on all this. So there's, I want to argue that this election means something more than just electoral turnover. However, I also believe that with the information we have about the election and about the political context in Mexico, you could argue that the recent election is a sign of democratic normalcy. It was just an election where the leading opposition party was able to win against the party in government, and the party in government was rated badly in various measures by most of the population. And in Mexico, although that sounds obvious, of course we were not used to that up until the early 2000s. And actually, if you see recent electoral history in Mexico, you see a lot of competition, particularly at the local level. There's a lot of turnover from party to party, from right, center, and left. But there is one difference from that scenario of increasing competition, and it's that this election, the Morena and AMLO won by a huge landslide. It wasn't just that the party in government was kicked out, but how it was kicked out. So I just want to show you, I have a couple of graphs for that show the results to give you an idea of the size of the landslide, because it is something quite spectacular for a party that was just formed 4 years ago, although we can discuss what that means. And so this, I don't know if that's clear. Well, apparently the letters are too small, but I'll try to explain. The maps on the top are the electoral results for the presidential election in 2012, and the maps on the bottom are from 2018. The ones on the left are the parties that show the results for the first place in each district, the ones on the middle for the second place in each district, and the ones on the right for the third place in each district. As you can see, for 2012, most of the north of the country is red, and that's because the PRI won the election, and it won most of the districts on the north of the country. There are some of the districts on the first map on the top of the left, on the south of the country, which were won by the left, and few won by the PAN, which at that moment went down to the third place overall. But then, if you look at the bottom maps, the most districts in the country, more than 270, were won by the left. Actually, not a single district was won by the PRI, and the left did not rank on third place in any district in the whole country in this last election. Just to make that more precise, these are the number of districts that were won depending on first, second, and third place. Also, the electoral results for the 2000 elections, for the 2006 on the top, 2012 and 2018 on the bottom. And as you can see on the bottom, basically, there were no, as I said, no districts won by the PRI, and almost all districts won by Morena. And if you compare it to the past, there was a more equal distribution on who would be on the first, second, and third place overall, except for the left, which by 2000, it almost did not exist in the 2000 election, but then it started winning its places depending on the results. But 2018, the PRI almost disappears, and the Morena becomes the top party in terms of results. This probably it's not clear. I can't see it here, so I'm not sure if you can see it there. It's not very clear. But also what's important is this is the difference between the first and the second place in each district. Okay, so in blue we have the winning party. Again, it's the 2000, 2006, 2012, and 2018 election. And what's important in terms of the difference between these elections is that the winning party in the 2018 election, which is the Morena, here it's Izquierda, that's the short I used in Spanish. The difference between, on average, the difference between the first and the second place in each district was much bigger for Morena than it had been for any other party in past elections. So it was not only that Morena won overall in terms of the amount of votes, it's that it won all over the country, particularly in the north, which had never been a place where the Mexican left had developed any kind of political structure. And in those places that it won by a spread that is, with the second place, that is much bigger than what had happened in previous elections. So in this sense, it's not a typical electoral result, at least for Mexican presidential elections. And finally, this is the composition of Congress. Again, the top donuts are for 2012 in the case of the Senate on the left. And as you can see, the green side of the Senate, that's the PRI, which had the majority in 2012 in the Senate. The yellow is the PRD, which was the left at that point, and then the blue is the PAN, with some small parties lying around. But then you see also the Senate results at the bottom, and all the red is for Morena, for the left, plus the purple, that's the coalition, it's all the red plus the purple. And then the PRI coalition is just the green dots with both colors, and also a light blue one. And then the traditional left, which was the PRD, as you can see, it became very small. And we have similar results for the Chamber of Deputies. Also, I did not put all the graphs here, but there hadn't been a single party or a single coalition that had won so many seats in both the Senate and in the Chamber of Deputies since 1997. This is like a straightforward majority. There's no negotiation with smaller parties, etc. In terms of the coalition that was elected. The coalition that has the majority is composed of 3 parties. We don't know if they will behave as a coalition in Congress, but considering the size of the support for AMLO, it is likely that that coalition will also be the governing coalition. It may even increase, as Pablo says. So even if this might look just like electoral turnover, it might also be reflecting some type of change or different things that are changing in Mexico. One hypothesis is that finally, since the 1990s, there were many reforms that took place in Mexico, not only democratic reforms, but also economic reforms. And in most of Latin America, in the early 2000s, after those reforms, the Washington Consensus reforms took place, the left came to power as a reaction to those reforms. Well, in Mexico, that did not happen. It's like Mexico is riding the pink tide, as they call it in Latin America, but a few years later than the rest of Latin America. That's a possible explanation. There were more structural reforms that were carried out in this government than in the previous one. So there was the energy reform, which opened the oil industry to private actors. And also there was the education reform, which implied a labor reform in the teachers' union, basically. And there was also a telecommunications reform. So it might be a reaction to those reforms that we're looking at. That's why it's so big. Also, one of the things that, sorry, I did not point out earlier is that this might look like electoral normalcy or democratic normalcy, but there were more than 100 attacks, violent attacks against politicians during the elections, and around 40 of them were killed. Most of the politicians killed were local level politicians. One could say that precisely because Mexican institutions are so strong now that they're resilient to this kind of violence, nobody thought, okay, we have to suspend elections because some local politicians have been killed, most likely by organized crime, so we shouldn't have any elections, and maybe there would be some push for a strong armed military government or something like that. There's absolutely no discussion about that. Nobody thought that that could be a possibility. Even if there had been 80 and not 40 politicians killed, I don't think that would have changed how things progressed. Another possible source of change might be just that the accumulation of inequality and, let's say, elite behavior regarding corruption and the reflection of that inequality in terms of everyday life also has accumulated through time, and that led to voters that were angrier at the social structure in Mexico, not just inequality, but all other types of representations of inequality, like access to education or access to health or just quality of life. We know that inequality has increased in all of those things, so that's another possibility. And finally, I will say that my impression is that what changed is that the structure of politics in Mexico has been changing since the 1990s. And that has implied that the state has changed dramatically and how the state controls the territory in Mexico. So going back to the 20th century, as you know, we had a hegemonic party system, but that party was not only a party in power, but it had 3 or 4 elements by which, corporations by which it penetrated the territory. It went down from the top, from the president. The president could raise his telephone and get in touch with a person in a very remote area that had some kind of political contact to the party structure. That is not the case anymore. So with these reforms that Pablo mentioned earlier, it was not only that the economic structure of the country changed, it was not only that there was electoral competition, but that the traditional unions or campesino organizations dissolved and lost power gradually. And a landslide this big could only take place once these unions did not control the population as they did in the past. So the example I always use is that in the 20th century, in Mexican rural towns, and particularly like ejidos, you know, the collective land property, if there was a problem, someone would call the head of the Central Nacional Campesina in the town, then that person would call the head of the CNC in the state, then that person would call someone in the Secretaría de Gobernación, and they would send a political operative or the military, all the police, to solve a problem. Now, when you're in a rural town in Mexico and there's some kind of problem, there's no one to call. It's not clear that there's a connection between small towns and the federal government in any substantive way. And that being the case, what we see, although we can see here is a landslide election led by Morena. If you look closely at who is getting elected at the state and municipal level, these are not party cadres that have been formed by a party and they act in or that they look like members of a party that have been homogenized by some kind of ideological or political practice. It's just local politicians that have found a new niche in this party to compete for power where they had been left out for various reasons. But many of them come from the traditional parties in Mexico. Some of them come from the traditional unions and campesino organizations. And some of them are just part of everyday hyper-local politics. And they found in Morena a place to participate. So if we'll close, you probably will also see how things have changed in terms of that local politics have become way more relevant than they were in the past. So even if decentralization nominally existed in Mexico, my impression is that this landslide is a consequence of actual political decentralization, even if it looks like the landslide from a single party. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, Andrés, thank you, and Pablo. Let me just pick up on some of the things that you guys said and have a conversation here, and we can open it up for more discussion with the audience. But it seems that there's a kind of fundamental paradox that I wonder if you can reflect on. So on the one hand, and I would agree, this election represents a step forward in Mexico's institutionalization of its democratic process, right? It was overwhelmingly democratic election, despite the violence. They didn't call anything off. We see this radically transformed electoral map. As you've just pointed out, Morena has now created opening at the grassroots level for a new kind of organic democratic process to take place, which is the most important in terms of breaking and reconfiguring that state structure that has existed for so long in Mexico. Yet the flip side of that is that the focus on AMLO, right, as a potential populist, et cetera. And that reputation, in large part, comes precisely because of his reaction following the 2006 election, which he lost by a hair. And instead of contributing to the democratic institutionalization at that moment, he picked up, his toys and he said no. He cried foul and he declared himself the president in 2006. And he conducted a parallel presidency and shut down Mexico City and other places in protest. And I don't even know at what point he ever officially decided he was no longer president. But that was what ruined and disenchanted his reputation amongst the middle class. He had tremendous support amongst the middle class in 2006. He had been a very competent mayor of Mexico City, which is larger than many countries. He had a lot of support in 2006. He may or may not have won that election, but in any event, it was a very small margin of loss. But in the succeeding elections, including most recently, right, he lost that support from the middle class, and there's a lot of fear by the middle class. So how do we reconcile that disconnect between this kind of grassroots populism, which might portend, or hopefully portends, a strengthening of Mexico's democratic system, sort of a complete restructuring of that and a consolidation of democracy, with the figure at the top who has, let's say, anti-democratic tendencies, or who is it, Krause or Castañeda, his messianic populist inclinations.
You want to answer that?
Yeah.
And then I have.
So yes, the 2006 election and AMLO's reaction to the election is probably what marked. Well, actually, so yeah, it was very important, and many people in the 2012 and during the 6 years between 2006 and 2012 were completely disenchanted, the ones that had supported AMLO originally. And also the opposition grew stronger, the opposition to AMLO, meaning we have evidence that AMLO will not respect democratic institutions. However, the reputation as a populist comes before 2006, and actually it was part of the campaign against him in 2006. We already had the comparisons to Chavez, and in TV, the TV ads were completely about the Venezuelan army arming Mexicans and stuff like that. And I think that the most important thing that we have to recall from those years is that in 2000, it was the first democratic election in Mexico. We had a new party in power, which was the right-wing party, the PAN, and everybody expected that democratic normalcy would start in 2000. But by 2005, the federal government and the president personally was trying to, there's no other way to put it, but put AMLO in jail so that he wouldn't compete in the election. So the reaction of AMLO to the results of 2006 can only be understood by the desafuero, which was the intention of not letting him compete. And his argument was, how can we call this a democracy if the president personally tried to stop the opposition from competing against his party, right? And so I think that what has changed, I mean, through time, is that the insistence, or AMLO's insistence in that he actually believes in democracy, etc., has accumulated through time with the evidence that actually, even if he declared himself president, he did not do anything else except declaring himself president. Electoral institutions kept on running, and whenever he could, him or his associates would participate in any electoral competition. They never said, we will not compete. They said, it's unfair, we believe that they are against us, but we're going to keep on competing. So some of the interpretations that you cited from Krause and Castañeda, I think that they overstress the 2006 behavior of AMLO as an isolated behavior from the political context of the moment. And that's when it looks like really like an authoritarian reaction to losing, and not as a political dispute that had been taking place for the last 4 or 5 years.
But just, you know, I mean, arguably, had he not reacted in that way in 2006, he might have made a stronger showing in 2012, and the PRD might have held together.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, I think that the fact that this time he didn't run with the PRD is very important too. I mean, in 2006, he was running as the candidate of the PRD, which was the party that emerged basically after the 1988 elections that were, you know, massive electoral fraud, right? I mean, so it was a very slow building of a party that by 2006 was a very unwieldy party, right? I mean, it was divided in tribes, had, you know, enough power in some governorships and Congress and municipalities that they didn't want to lose. You know, it was becoming something that didn't work from the point of view of López Obrador. So Morena is a new party that obviously has a lot of people who were in the PRD, but also from other parties, and has a very different logic in terms of also of the way it responded to these challenges of you know, the democratic process. No, I mean, I think it's I would say more like a social democrat party that is not so focused on the marginalization of that, you know, happened in the decades before 2006 up to 2006. No? So I think it's a very different candidate now, and the messiahs, you know, theory, it's in, you know, I think it was there before. You know, Krause was talking about Mexican history as a history of different kings, you know, ruling the country since pre-Hispanic times, right? So, you know, López Obrador fits very well, right? I mean, if you interpret him like that, no? And that has become, you know, a very common resource. I mean, if you look at the way people are commenting on the results of the elections and the behavior of López Obrador in these days, they're all talking about style and personality and, you know, if he doesn't have bodyguards, if he has, all these things that obviously are very important if you're focusing on identifying populist tendencies, right? Rather than trying to understand what's going on with local politics and electoral coalitions, which is the real change here. Huh? So.
I have another question related to things that you said, both you. Do you see then this election as a protest, that is a protest against the way that Peña Nieto governed, the protest against all that sort of is happening in Mexico now, or as a program of action? Because it seems that what's happening in terms of who voted, it's you know, both, right? And so what does that mean legislatively and in terms of popular support? What kind of, you know, window, honeymoon, do you think, you know, AMLO and the Morena party will have if, you know, this coalition, in the same way that Fox was both a protest and a program when he came to power in 2000?
I mean, very briefly, maybe you want to. I mean, I think that the idea that I mean, this is just a protest vote implies that there are no, you know, that it's just an impulse, you know, like a reflex to what's going on. But the central idea in López Obrador's platform was, I'm going to fight corruption. The details obviously are still to be established, right? But I think it's a very important ideological point that he's making. I mean, the state cannot do anything. You know, there's complete impunity. There's no control over institutions. So I'm going to change that. And in my view, that reflects an ideology or a set of beliefs that are positive, not just negative. You know, we're saying, you know, the state can do these things. We just have to have a state that is not corrupt. I mean, obviously, as I said, you know, how does that work? If you just listen to speeches and electoral propaganda, it would sound as if, you know, just because he sits in the presidential, you know, chair, everything will change.
Every candidate in Mexico from, you know, the 1940s forward preaches anti-corruption. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's been a common, you know, trope and political slogan. So, and as we know, when the PRI would come to power, you know, each election they would, you know, have some high-profile jailing and, you know, do all these anti-corruption drives. So, how is he going to do this that's any different than anyone else has done it?
I don't know, but I mean, the basic idea is that he's no, I mean, if you can preach against corruption, if you do preach against corruption from the PRI or from the PAN, I mean, it doesn't sound right. There's a problem with that statement, right? This is an outsider, you know, to an extent. So I think that made what he was saying more, you know, plausible. But again, I mean, there's I think a great degree in belief in the power of the presidency to change things, you know, which kind of magical thinking in a way, you know. What matters is really what happens at the local level, you know, and the oversight power of Congress. That would be interesting. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I do think that it was a protest vote, particularly against the PRI, the PRI, but it was not only against the PRI. It really did become, it had always been, or for a long time, the symbol of corruption, the PRI. At least since the 80s, it became electorally the symbol of corruption. And then what happened in 2012 is that people were so fed up already with violence and with the incompetence of the PAN that the PRI could make a credible argument in 2012 that they were effective at governing, even if they were corrupt. And in Spanish, in Mexico, there's this famous phrase, que regresen los corruptos y se vayan los pendejos, right? So we'd rather have someone that is corrupt than someone that's an idiot in government. But then the PRI proved that they were both corrupt and even more visibly corrupt than the PAN, but they also proved incompetent. And so in that sense, I do think that there is a protest vote, and that also explains the expansion of the voting patterns to the north of the country, which had traditionally not been present. And we can see also the change in the rhetoric of López Obrador. So in 2000, the main campaign slogan was, for the good of all, the poor first, right? And now the main emphasis of his campaign, as Pablo said, was the fight against corruption. And the understanding, or his understanding of corruption, appears to have two components. One is his personal honesty and certain asceticism, I guess. He always tries to show that he doesn't care about money. So he drives a small car, he will close down the presidential palace, he will live in the middle-class neighborhood he's been living for a long time, etc. And the other element is administrative. And this is probably the thing that is harder to understand, particularly for Mexicans, because we see corruption all over the place, and it's particularly visible in politicians and politicians that participate in electoral politics and in parties. We see money going around, we don't know where that money is coming from. They are sitting in the Senate with watches that are worth hundreds and thousands of dollars, stuff like that. But the type of corruption that AMLO is obsessed about, and is obsessed since the 1980s, is like everyday administrative corruption, which goes in the form of very small contracts that are recurrent. So that there's someone interested in controlling how much the money you charge in the bathrooms in the subway in Mexico City. So the service of the bathrooms in the subway in Mexico City is a very bad service. And the government may try to fix it, but in the end they don't fix it because there's someone extracting a rent from that. And when AMLO says that he's going to fight corruption, he's saying that he's going to end the type of corruption that decreases the quality and performance of government. So that's why it's compatible in a way to see AMLO accept within his coalition politicians that have been identified with corruption, because they have been identified with a type of corruption, mostly moving money for the political party, etc., that is not the type of corruption that he believes changes the performance of government. And his main policy proposal, and this is something that needs to be discussed more generally about what is the left in Mexico and what does AMLO represent, is administrative reform, and that administrative reform looks like big cutbacks in certain types of government spending. So the bureaucracy will be slimmed down dramatically, because he doesn't believe that you can increase taxes without first showing that the government is willing to sacrifice. The argument is the government should be able to sacrifice its own resources before asking people to sacrifice theirs. So he has announced huge cutbacks, and then what they call reorienting government expenditures. So instead of spending money on consultants for the government, they will spend money on social programs and direct cash transfers, etc. And I think that that is an answer that matches very well the kind of protest that was represented in the election. So if people saw that the problem is that the government is incompetent plus corrupt, AMLO's argument is very appealing. We're not asking you to pay more taxes. We're only asking you, what we will do is that when we get in power is that we'll cut back government expenditure on things that are superfluous and redirect it to things that will increase performance, and you will notice that performance very fast. That is very similar to what he did as mayor in Mexico City, which was government cutbacks in the bureaucracy and a universal pension for everybody above 65 years of age in Mexico City, etc.
Let me ask one last question, then we'll open it up, and that has to do with U.S.-Mexican relations, but the question of Mexican nationalism, more broadly speaking. There are a few questions related to this that come to my mind. One is this, what is Mexican nationalism now? We know what that has meant sort of historically in the ways in which the PRI is mobilized that nationalism. It's not so clear to me what it means today, that term, if it exists in the same way or not. So that's kind of one maybe more intellectual question. But I can imagine sort of two different kinds of scenarios that are going to come into play inevitably that will create frictions or that will generate new forms of tensions with the United States. One is that, Trump would say something or do something, right? And so AMLO's supporters were sort of, demand of him, you know, a dignified response, right? Something more than Peña Nieto did, and you know, to stand up for Mexican honor. So I can see that, the kind of push from below on him to respond in a way that could generate a kind of, you know, cycle of rhetorical conflict. The other way I can see nationalism being used is that he will find it useful to mobilize from above a nationalist response in order to deepen his own coalition and create a momentary, transitory perhaps, sense of political power, political support, in order to affect certain kinds of changes, whether it's a negotiating strategy with the United States or vis-a-vis other kinds of contracts with other governments or foreign investors or what have you. So what do you think is at stake with Mexican nationalism in the U.S.-Mexican relationship? I mean, you were suggesting, Pablo, and I tend to agree on the one hand, but I'm not totally convinced that Mexico is kind of locked into a certain straitjacket in its relationship. And so, you know, in a way, maybe as Canada is, you know, so Trump can call Trudeau a little man, you know, and he's going to go ahead and call AMLO a little man because, you know, the U.S. holds the cards. We have the biggest market. We have the you know, key sources of investment. And that's kind of realpolitik, right? But, you know, the flip side of that is Mexico's, you know, revolutionary nationalism historically is a very powerful force on the one hand. And on the other, you know, the world is dramatically shifting in terms of what trade, investment, and alliances even mean. Are we conceivably in a kind of dramatic upheaval that perhaps offers new kinds of relationships to come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's, as I say, I mean, I don't think that bringing up the rhetorical level will help or is something that AMLO will provoke. I mean, he will try probably to avoid it, just like Peña Nieto did, right? But it's inevitable that something will come up out of, you know, Trump's mouth, you know, that will be insulting, you know. So the question is what to do with it. You want to mobilize xenophobic nationalism from the, you know, bottom up and consolidate power, or be cautious, no? Because you can lose, you know, economically. I think we'll have to see what happens. My impression is, judging by who's appointed the Minister of Foreign Relations, is that it will be a very cautious, you know, diplomatic strategy, trying to maintain, you know, basically what all governments in Mexico are trying to do. You know, there are many things that connect us to the U.S., so we have to keep them running. You know, there's the security, there's the trade, there's the political aspect. So as long as we can keep moving in all these parallel routes, we shouldn't, you know, we should be very, you know, cautious and I would say conservative. The other thing that I would add, I don't know if you agree with this, is that I was really impressed that, you know, that all the political forces accepted that López Obrador won, and they recognized the triumph immediately. And I don't know if the relation with the U.S. is a factor there. In other words, that the political class in Mexico thinks that a big division now, or the kind of, you know, incendiary rhetoric that we saw in 2006 would damage the country, therefore their interests. You know? So they're willing to say, you know, we can have a López Obrador government as long as that doesn't break up or, you know, the national unity, you know? And in that, I mean, if López Obrador can exploit that, it will, you know, really be something that will help him broaden the coalition, you know? So, you know, I guaranteeing, you know, national unity, you know, when we have these outside forces. I have that impression, but I don't have much to back it up. So.
I agree that it's mostly a straitjacket. It's very hard to move, and I think that it will probably look like it did for most of the 20th century. Like there might be some rhetorical differences from what we've seen in the last 18 years, but they will be mostly rhetorical, and the political positions or the political positions in the world stage will probably won't be very different from what we've seen. One thing that's interesting, actually, the reaction from the left against Trump is that everybody in Mexico dislikes Trump deeply. I mean, everybody. There's no like a small current of opinion that says, no, Trump is actually, I mean, there must be like really 3 people in Mexico that are Trump supporters. And what that did for the Mexican left is that, for example, the Mexican left opposed NAFTA for most of the time, has opposed NAFTA for most of the time. Particularly at the moment where NAFTA was most beneficial, you could argue, to the Mexican economy, the Mexican left was, this is destroying the countryside, you are changing the whole structure of agricultural production, and that has consequences, etc. But then the effects of NAFTA changed also through the last 10 years. You could argue that NAFTA, Mexico has not benefited that much from NAFTA as it did in the late 1990s. But at the same time, Trump comes out against NAFTA. And the reaction of the Mexican left is, no, actually now we're for NAFTA. So actually we're against anything that Trump represents. So in the Mexican political discourse, Trump is so extreme and just regular political behavior that I think that will keep on happening. It will be seen for most Mexicans, whatever you do against Trump, it's okay, but you don't need to do much more. You just have to say, I disagree with Trump. And then the real important things that link Mexico and the United States aren't easy to change. And I don't think a López Obrador government would try to change that too much. They might change some things. There is some economic nationalism in his rhetoric, there's no doubt, and in his program. I mean, though in the Mexican context, it might mean, in the Mexican context, that we are one of the countries that did most of the neoliberal reforms that were taken as far as possible. We signed as many free trade agreements as possible. It does seem like economic nationalism, but in other countries, there are things that are not too controversial. There's an interest and an insistence on energy, seguridad energética, how do you say? I forgot in English, but that we have our own oil and produce our own gas, etc., and also with food security, but it has clear limits in terms of how far they can take it, and I don't think they're willing to push those limits too far.
All right, let's open it up here and maybe say your name and where you're from.
I want to ask you, one of the things that people at the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, worry is whether he will be able to change the Constitution. As far as I've seen, he has more or less 3/5 of senators and 3/5 in the Congress, in the diputados. So, and he needs half the states to change the constitution. When do you think that will happen?
So he's close to the 2/3 majority for both the Senate and the Congress.
Yeah, so he
close,
has.
yeah, and people expect that maybe members of the PRI, on the left side of the PRI, might join Morena, or the PRD, which is AMLO's former party, might join Morena. At the same time, it was not only that Morena won 5 state governments, but in every state government where there was a legislative election, Morena won a majority, right? So they're also closer to the 2/3 majority, right? in local congresses. However, at least AMLO has been insistent on this since he was mayor of Mexico City and throughout his career. And he says that the problem is not the Constitution, the problem is not the law, but it's honesty and administration. And there are, in his program, in his government program, there are no big plans for constitutional reform. Actually, he considers himself a textualist from the 1917 Constitution, and some people criticize him for that. Like, if you take seriously and read textually the 1917 Constitution, it has much more problems than we might imagine. So I wouldn't expect him to change the Constitution.
Yes, my name is Vito Echevarria. I'm a journalist with the Miami-based publication known as CubaStandard.com. I'm going to ask you a two-part question. This is something totally different from what you guys are expecting. First part is, does AMLO have any relationship to Cuba at all? That's number one. Number two, is there a possibility that the Cuban government at some point can negotiate some type of deal to get cheap oil from Mexico anywhere near the terms that it's gotten from Venezuela, since Venezuela has become a much less reliable source of petroleum for Cuba?
I followed very closely the NAFTA negotiations in 1994, and as you may know, NAFTA was created by what I would call the Mexican technocrats who got their PhDs in economics from Yale and Harvard and elsewhere. And I talked to one senior diplomat who said that for Mexico to become a modern country, it had to push the farmers off the land and into factories. And that was the reason—
Into the United States.
Well, that's another dimension, but they completely accepted that the agricultural industry of the United States, and this is from a Mexican, would come into the U.S. and then force the campesinos off the farms and into factories. And from a technocratic viewpoint, the former chief economist of Goldman Sachs has said that by 2050, Mexico should be the 6th largest economy in the world, which I think some of the technocrats would agree with. What is intriguing to me is that AMLO is not an elite technocrat. And I've been intrigued by what he has said about that Mexico should restore the farm policies that it used to have to subsidize and to create more agricultural productivity in Mexico. And so I asked this in the context of the NAFTA negotiations because I heard the grandson of President Cardenas say when he was governor that the relationship between the United States, especially Orange County, California, which I grew up in, was very important to the future of Mexico, and that there should be these close relationships on all kinds of levels between the people of the United States and the people of Mexico. And I'm not sure that President Obrador agrees with this.
Let me just briefly respond to the Cuba question. I mean, the death of Castro, B, the fact that the U.S. has at least nominal diplomatic relations with Cuba, technically at least, right, makes it a lot easier to do anything for any country in Latin America, for that matter. Mexico's always had a, as you know, I'm sure, a longstanding relationship with Cuba that only under Fox began to get reconfigured a little bit, but I think, there'll be no rupture there. But also, I mean, Cuba is getting now investment from China, in particular, and Russia, in terms of exploring its oil fields. That's the way to go. Yeah, no, sure. Wait, and there may be some conflict over sort of who owns those oil fields because they fall in between Cuba and Mexican waters and U.S. So, but yeah, whether or not Mexico will ship oil to Cuba, I'm not, sure per se. But I'm sure Mexico will at least have a symbolic relationship with Cuba. In terms of the agricultural thing, maybe you guys can talk more about it, but I'm sure AMLO will be very happy to put tariffs on imports of Mexican corn, of U.S. corn to Mexico. Mexico is a net importer of corn to try to, respond to the crisis of agriculture in the countryside. So in terms of, what's going to happen with NAFTA negotiations, Trump's, opening up that. He's encouraging tariffs, right? So it gives Mexico a lot of room there to play.
The question on Mexican oil, well, Mexican oil production has reduced dramatically. So I don't think Mexico is giving cheap oil to anyone. And gas production has collapsed. I mean, Mexico is importing huge amounts of gas from the US particularly. And then the second thing about the technocrats and their worldview, one thing that appears to change, I don't know how much and we'll see, but at least in the personnel recruitment in, for example, the treasury in Mexico probably will change. We've been used for the last 30 years to have the people from, particularly that come from the same college in Mexico, originally from UNAM, but people from ITAM have mostly dominated the treasury. But with the appointments that we know of still, which are at the top of the treasury, it's people from UNAM and then from the Colegio de Mexico. And that also will change in other ministries, not only the treasury, right? So we'll probably see a different worldview on that. And related to agriculture, I don't see, or at least AMLO's economic team has not talked about tariffs for agriculture. They have talked about guaranteeing prices to producers. In terms of corn, Mexico imports a lot of yellow corn. Something that is very important for Mexicans is that our corn is white and not yellow. It tastes very differently in tortillas, etc. So apparently Mexico imports a lot of yellow corn, which is mostly used to feed animals. But on white corn, we are self-sufficient. So I'm not sure that they will go that way in terms of agriculture.
So I'm wondering about the prominence and centrality of the issue of corruption, whether you have any thoughts on that being in some ways an easy stand-in for an even larger and more elusive problem, which is the one that Andrés brought up of structural inequality in the country. You mentioned that you see the election as, kind of a long-term movement away from the impact of neoliberalism and the massive income and wealth redistribution that's happened in Mexico. Are there any signs that that's actually becoming an audible or actionable issue in Mexico? I mean, in the sense that corruption is, I don't know if I agree with that, your observation that sort of the everyday forms of corruption are the way that it's going to be solved on a national scale. That's much easier to do in an urban setting and make these symbolic moves than it is in a national setting. But even as intractable as the question of corruption is in Mexico, is the larger question of income and wealth and other forms of power inequality an even more intractable, sort of the white elephant in the election?
The vote has shown that the local vote has become more relevant. Does that mean that the local authorities will have access to the military to bring about change? And will the locals have more access to their own source of revenue?
My name is Alcira Forero Peña, and I would like to hear from you about food security in terms of the AMLO's platform government. And also maybe if you could at least make a reference to his platform for the environment.
Okay, so if I understood what we've got on the table here, one's a question about structural inequalities and whether or not there is any real possibility of addressing that, or if that's just more rhetorical. Maybe that's your question, Paul, I think, or along those lines. Second question having to do with arms and violence, and I mean, the question of the role of the military. One thing that AMLO has referred to is to push the military back into the barracks, right? There's been a creeping militarization over the last 10, 15 years in response to the drug wars, et cetera. So, and the military's has been seen in relative terms as less corrupt, right, than more professional than the other multiple police forces that have been established. So what's the role of violence and armament more generally? And then the question of the environment, I think, and food security in the environment. And is the Green Party is so bad in Mexico, but are they part of AMLO's coalition? I can't remember. Oh, good, thank God. Yeah, they're like, I don't know how they managed to, they should be sued for having that name, right? Copyright, exactly. Okay, so go ahead.
I'll just be very briefly and let Andrés answer most of these questions. I mean, I think the corruption has different meanings that have been changing recently, I think. Because I think that, you know, the scandals surrounding Peña Nieto had an impact. And those are not the kind of, you know, small everyday corruptions that, you know, that López Obrador is talking about. But that must have had some impact on especially the middle class vote in the North, no? Where this has been an old tradition that the PAN had, you know, for many years, right? I mean, this kind of honesty of the politicians. But regarding, you know, whether that is a way to talk about inequality that avoids the problem, right? I don't know, I'm going to say this, but you know, you might not agree, but I think that Mexican voters are basically very conservative, and they say, you know, the system is not what needs to change. It's just the way in which it is implemented and the day-to-day, you know, gestión, as they say, you know. So if we have somebody in power that will do what they have to do, that will give us a chance, you know. In other words, I don't think that by talking about corruption that we're talking about inequality. I think that there is a wide acceptance of violence and inequality in Mexico, and that's not, you know, I don't think that was, you know, captured by the corruption slogan. Yeah, I think so, yeah. Yeah, but I'll let you.
I mean, this is, I agree with Pablo, but maybe related to this question is, there's a researcher that did some surveys during the campaigns, and he asked, AMLO makes reference to the past a lot. And particularly in this election, he explicitly said that the country was better off between 1940 and 1980, right? And he used phrase like, if you remember the movies, the Cantinflas movies from the golden Mexican period, people respected teachers. So in the surveys, this researcher asked people what they thought about, if they agreed or disagreed with if Mexico was better between 1940 and 1980, and if they thought that in the past it was like in Cantinflas' movies. And AMLO voters by far agreed with those statements. So I guess corruption has been present throughout Mexican history, and it has been part of the political dispute. But I think that there is, that people look back at government performance a lot. So yes, corruption might in some way also, when they talk about corruption, talk about inequality, but I agree with Pablo that it's mostly, when people think about corruption, it's like, we shouldn't change the law, we don't have to change the Constitution. Actually, our Constitution has so many rights of all type that if they were really taken seriously, if not for corruption, then there wouldn't be inequality. So inequality is a consequence of corruption. And that is like AMLO 101, right? That's his basic argument about almost everything. Yeah. Then about local authority, in the last 20 years, local revenue has increased, both at mostly at the municipal level. At the state level, it's a lot harder because they receive a lot of money from the federal government, and there's a lot of inequality between municipalities. So there are some municipalities that have a lot of local revenue. Legally, local revenue is spent at the local level, and in terms access to security forces or the army, again, legally, local governments control the police, and that's why local police are the target of criminal organizations. So it's a very complicated situation in which people are angry at the army because they intervene in local disputes, but at the same time, there's no one else to intervene. So when you remove the army, people feel unsafe, and when the army is present and commit human rights violations, people are angry against the army, and I mean, it's a complicated situation. And that was it, right? Food security. Well, yes, so in Mexico, the term food security, it's because there's a very, it's very hard to express and to convey how stringent ideological disputes can be in Mexico because they have been ideologically dominated by the neoliberal consensus, etc. So just using the term food security, like in the media, it's a huge controversy. And then people are like, but why, what do you really mean? Are you going to control prices? Are you going to put tariffs? So the only thing, after AMLO said, our aim is to increase food security, the only concrete thing that he mentioned was guaranteed prices for certain agricultural products, but that's it. And in terms of the environment, I'm not sure, but he is a big believer in oil production and cheap oil and cheap gas. So yeah, but there are some other things there in the Morena's platform.
Didn't he also institute the Metrobus in Mexico City, right? And the woman who was in charge of it then just got appointed to, I forgot what her position is.
She's the mayor of Mexico City.
That's right. Okay, right. So she became mayor. That's right. And she had been his former, right? So.
Yeah. So I mean, if you look at the documents, there are many things about the environment, but it's clear that his priorities are more on cheap. There is an argument about inequality, locational inequality in Mexico. So it's very the decisions people make about where to locate, where to live, and where to have a job, and also where factories and businesses set up are based on huge gas subsidies that have existed for a long time. So when you have a sudden change in gas prices, it's very hard for the people to absorb it as part of their income. And actually, there was a huge shock in gas prices a year ago, or a bit more than a year ago, and that is what changed electoral preferences dramatically. So Morena and López Obrador started going up very fast when the Mexican government removed most of the gas subsidy. Yeah.
Michael, what's the relationship that he's going to have with the judiciary, especially if you put since corruption's so central? Because corruption has been a pretty double-edged sword. If you look at a place like Brazil, corruption charges can quickly get into the judiciary and bring down governments. So what power does he have within the Mexican judicial system? And what does that mean when you're going to put corruption at the center of your governance?
Yeah, I mean, the president can appoint, a lot of the judiciary, yeah. So, but I am not sure that, López Obrador is in favor of increasing the autonomy of the judiciary. I mean, there's been a debate recently about the appointment of the Attorney General. A reform is going through, I think, state congresses to have an autonomous or a more autonomous Attorney General. But AMLO is not going to use that. He wants to appoint his own Attorney General, which, leads me to think that there will be some way to deal with the judiciary that is not entirely, new. I mean, the Minister of Gobernación is a former Supreme Court judge. So I don't think that implies that plans to, revolutionize, the judiciary.
Also, I mean, isn't it really just inevitable before accusations of corruption, true or untrue, start getting hurled at Morena candidates? Maybe AMLO, let's say for the sake of argument, remains above that, but it will taint the party and undermine his credibility, right? I mean, that's just, Mexican politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Latin American politics.
I think it's hard to know how. I mean, I don't want to say it because it sounds like I'm repeating what I've heard in interviews for him. But he says that he will let the judiciary run independently, and the argument is the following, and it's that in Mexico, judicial institutions have been used politically, right, or the prosecutor's office, etc. So he says, of course, there's corruption in the current government, and it is likely that there will be corruption in his government at some kind. But he says we're not going to use politically those institutions. So if those institutions do their job in a non-political way, then he won't intervene. Evidence we have from the past, when he was mayor of Mexico City, one of these huge corruption cases he was fighting against went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he confronted the Supreme Court because he disagreed with the ruling. In the end, he was right and the Supreme Court was wrong, and it was someone that had, I mean, it was the type of corruption that is this everyday type of corruption that people would make up documents of ownership and then claim that the state expropriated their land, which was originally government land. That went up all the way to Supreme Court, and rhetorically he has attacked the Supreme Court continually, right? He will be able to appoint, I think, at least 3 judges, or at least go through the appointment process of 3 judges. But it's hard to say what will actually happen.
Is this election any reaction to the behavior of what's going on in the United States politically? And also this part 2 to that is that how are the Mexican people feeling about the behavior of the government, the U.S. government, to folks who are trying to enter this country, and these ideas around, you know, having to pay the price for building a wall to keep their people from coming to, I can't, you know, I want to know how, because, you know, like I as an American, I think that everybody, you know, when I see what's going on in other countries, sometimes it's a reaction to us, and I'm wondering, I haven't heard any of that here. It seems like everything is about internalism, predominantly bureaucratic, it sounds like, but still. So that's my question.
Just pass it to behind you, yeah.
Hello, I'm Billy Reeves. I'm a student from Duquesne University. Very good presentation, first off, so great job to all of you. But mainly my question is, do you think President Obrador will try to secure the southern border in Mexico to prevent the massive overflow of people that are coming from the rest of Latin America, Central and South America?
I mean, as Andrés said, you know, everyone agrees that they don't like Trump, so it's not really a political factor, you know. I'm, you know, I don't know if you agree with this, but I don't think that the treatment of Mexicans in the U.S. is something that mobilizes Mexican voters in any way. It's, I mean, you would think it has to, because Mexico is a country of immigrants, right? I mean, but as far as I can tell, that wasn't part of the debates, or they barely talked about that in a debate about foreign policy. So I don't think that there's something that mobilizes people in Mexico. You know, going to the second question, I mean, that's one of the fields in which, you know, governance is very important, because, you know, the law in Mexico allows people to move within the country, and it's not, you're not going to be arrested or detained because you don't have papers. That's the law. The problem is the migra, the equivalent of, you know, ICE there. They are a very corrupt institution, and they are, you know, connected to the drug trafficking, you know, networks, right? So I don't think that cutting the flow of people is something that can even happen legally, you know. And much less in terms of the operation of border enforcement in Mexico. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, just, I mean, the only thing that I can think of influence of U.S. politics in Mexico in the recent election, or maybe the political evaluation of the current government, is the visit Trump did as a candidate to Mexico. That was, I think that added to, like, if corruption was symbolically represented by the PRI, incompetence / some kind of weakness slash some kind of treason was interpreted from that visit. It seemed like a humiliation, and it just felt like a humiliation, right? But that's mostly it. And then on the southern border, there are two things that should be taken into account. In the debate the candidates had where they supposedly were to talk about immigration, in which they mostly did not, López Obrador did say that Mexico will stop doing the U.S.'s dirty job in the southern border. And actually, he said that the offices of the Instituto Nacional de Migración would be moved to the northern border and removed from the southern border. Like, really saying it's not a problem. And also one of his main allies from non-party allies, meaning from organizations in civil society, is Alejandro Solalinde, who's a priest that has defended and has participated in caravans from Central American migrants, etc. So at least it would be, for me, very surprising that the López Obrador government didn't show any kind of understanding of the migration problem between Mexico and Central America and what it means in terms of migration to the U.S. They seem conscious of the problems around it. It's hard to know if it will have any consequence.
One thing also, just to state the obvious, any acceptance to pay, symbolically or otherwise, any portion of that wall would be political suicide. So no, it's never going to happen. And so it'll be interesting to see how that gets played out. Again, I think when Trump, I don't know if he was conscious of this or not, but during his campaign, he's like, well, we'll get Mexico to pay for it. In his mind, it may have still just been all about realpolitik. We've got the power, they need our mark, et cetera. But it's a good example where, honor Trump's power in that regard. So it'll be interesting to see how he eats that or takes it back. I think we're kind of out of time. Maybe a question or two? Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. Linda Corrin, New Jersey Institute of Technology adjunct, and I've been in about 13 other schools over 27 years, no tenure. I have a concern, appreciate anytime a country, a state, a city, a school district is trying to make things better. It takes time. Do you have any idea how long it will take in Mexico for certain things to get better? And I also say that with even in the U.S. when we have a problem with something, it takes time to fix that problem. So to make it better, nobody can guess, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, I mean, the Mexican economy has not been growing very fast, and I think that's the most important variable, for the success of short term, It will depend a lot also on how the U.S. economy does, but it's like, disappointment is inevitable in the sense that things take time,
Maybe there will be, and this is again speculation, maybe based on the experience of López Obrador as a mayor, he's big on symbols, right? And if corruption was one of the main issues and elite and government behavior, then he has a recipe to make people believe that things are getting better. And the first one is that he said that he would sell the presidential airplane, that he would close down, and he would close down the presidential palace, and that he wouldn't have any bodyguards, right? Those things which sound irrelevant, and when there are substantive and more important things, one wonders if we should be wasting
time
on
fixing
them.
corruption in the bathrooms in the metro?
Exactly, yeah.
So suddenly, they actually do mean something, and I think that many people will think that corruption is getting better because of that. We don't know what's the actual consequence.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but I think he's going to have a window because it will be inevitable that charges of corruption are thrown at Morena. And as soon as that begins to happen, it will undermine whatever sort of distinctive status as above this, that he and his party have enjoyed. So it will have a very short window, I suspect. I'm going to say thank you for coming. We're here if you want to chit-chat. But thanks, everyone, for coming out. Mauricio, I'm not sure if you're still here, but thank you for pulling it together. Welcome. Thank you, Pablo, Andrés.